Hello everyone, my name is Enda. I'm a Professor of Air Quality and Carbon Management in the Department of Geography and Environmental Management based at UWI. I'm the Director of a research centre there called the Air Quality Management Resource Centre, and we work at this interface between air quality science and air quality policy, working with everyone from local authorities to national governments and the European Commission. I was asked to come and talk to you today in terms of air pollution, but particularly focusing on one of the main aspects that I'm interested in, which is how citizens' behaviour generates pollution and how we can change the way we talk and think about air pollution. So air pollution is a rather fantastic indicator of the way in which our global systems are operating and working. It's a good indicator of the health, if you like, of the planet, and in particular of our urban environments. In terms of sources, we've got a number of natural sources such as volcanoes, dust, forest fires, but primarily when it comes to air quality management, we're more focused on transport and domestic heating and cooking, industry, agriculture, etc. Now, you do see impacts from natural sources. For example, when we had the forest fires last year in Australia, we were able to see the impact of the particles that came from those fires as far away as New Zealand. When we get things like Saharan dust storms in Northern Africa, we can see the effect of those particles here in the UK. So natural sources do cause transboundary issues that we need to be aware of and do provide a background, if you like, a background level of air pollution. But really, when we start to think about air quality management, in particular when we start to think about the impacts in terms of public health and well-being and the impacts in terms of habitats and on our ecosystems, then the management focus is on the anthropogenic sources, in particular transport, domestic heating and cooking in our urban environments, and agriculture in our rural environments. Now, air pollution doesn't sit on its own. It has this very complex interrelationship with a number of different issues that we have to deal with. For example, climate change, the sources of air pollution are quite often the same. So when it comes to carbon management and air quality management, you're always looking for those synergistic interventions that will actually bring about co-benefits for both. And there's also some very, very complex atmospheric chemistry that goes on in terms of air pollution as both a cooler, having a cooling effect, and also a heating effect on our atmosphere. It influences water and water quality in terms of things like acidification, eutrophication, but also in terms of the human environment. We do see this complex relationship in terms of air quality, socioeconomic status, environmental justice, social equity. And really one of the emerging areas that I've been particularly interested in is how our practices, our day-to-day behaviours influence air pollution. So in terms of sources, this is a graph that comes from the European Environment Agency, and it really is just to show the complexity that we have in terms of the number of different pollutants that we might be concerned with, and also the number of different sources which influence those pollutants. And as no surprise, you might see ammonia predominantly coming from agriculture, but when we look at something like nitrous oxide, you can see the importance of road transport. When we look at something like sulfur oxides, you can see the effect of energy production and industry. So really it's just showcasing the complexity that we have in terms of pollutants and also in terms of sources. Now, one of the things I always say is that we have to understand that we as a society choose air pollution. It's a consequence of the political decisions we make, the economic decisions, and the day-to-day societal or individual decisions that we make, and how we interact with our urban infrastructure and how we interact with the various different technologies that are available. But often the responses to air pollution challenges have lagged behind our awareness and our understanding of the problem. For example, in 1952, we had the London smogs, which in early December, we had an inversion, which resulted in 5-6 days of incredible smog conditions, which resulted in several thousand people dying during that short period, and subsequently dying in the weeks and months afterwards due to the effects of air pollution. Yet, there was a public outcry, yet it took 4 years before the Clean Air Act came in 1956. So they always have that lag between an event, the outcry, understanding of the science, and the intervention, the policies being put in place. And what we've seen over the last half a century, and particularly in the last decade, is the public's willingness to accept air pollution has changed quite substantially. And that might be an effect of the kind of Greta Thunberg effect. It might be the raised awareness through things like Extinction Rebellion. It may also be the fact that air pollution is much more in our media these days, whether it's to do with the health impacts, whether it's to do with the effect of air pollution due to lockdown and COVID-19, whether it's to do with things like Dieselgate, where we saw Volkswagen being caught for cheating in terms of their test cycles for their cars. So the public willingness and awareness has changed over time, and because of that, I think air pollution is much more in the public consciousness at the moment. So when we think of air pollution, we have to think about it in terms of a pollution pathway. It starts with these kind of sources that I've mentioned. You get chemical transformations and reactions with sunlight in the atmosphere. You do see an impact on weather in terms of wind speed, wind direction, rainfall. This will all affect the pollution. And then an impact in terms of topography, either in terms of the mountains, for example, around the city, like we see in a city such as Santiago in Chile. You have the mountains around it, and it creates a kind of a bowl effect. Combined with the meteorology, you get these inversion layers, which means the pollution just sits over the city because it can't escape. But also the impact you see in terms of the urban environment. For example, in Bath, where you have quite an old city, you have these very, very high buildings in narrow streets, and you get what's called a street canyon effect, where the buildings create a canyon, and what happens then is the pollution generated by cars going through that street canyon can't escape. It just circulates inside in the street canyon, and you get this cumulative effect. So you do have this pathway, and both the kind of physical environment can influence that, but also then the human interaction with that environment will quite heavily influence how we generate pollution, how we're exposed to pollution, and ultimately how we might mitigate against it. So why do we need to worry about it? Well, here in the UK and predominantly across Europe, the main concerns are particulate matter. So these are particles of a very, very fine fraction or fine size that can be inhaled and get into the bloodstream, and a gas called nitrogen dioxide. Now, here in the UK, nitrogen dioxide and particulate matter primarily come from road transport, but you can get it from solid fuel burning, particularly particulate matter. You can get it from agriculture, PM, etc. Now, ozone is one that we also worry about, but the problem with ozone is that it's due to a chemical reaction in the atmosphere, so it's very difficult. You can't address ozone itself. You have to try and address the precursors that result in ozone happening. And at the moment, it's the 24th of June. We're in the middle of a little heat wave here in the UK, and we do have moderate and some high ozone issues happening around the country, and these can impact on our health and impact on our food system. And finally, we think about things like nitrogen and ammonia and the impact that they can have from agriculture, the impact they can have in terms of our sensitive ecosystems. But within our urban environments, it's really public health where we're predominantly concerned. Now, there are two types of effects in both the short term and the long term. If you've got an existing issue such as asthma, and you've got a pollution event like we have in some parts of the country at the moment, where we've got moderate pollution levels, you can find yourself having a shortness of breath, and maybe you need to use your inhaler a little bit further. But in terms of the long-term effect, we do see effects in terms of our respiratory systems, and also some of those very, very fine particles can get into the bloodstream, and once they're in the bloodstream, they start to influence our cardiovascular systems, and indeed can get around many parts of the body. And there's been a lot of research looking at the influence of air pollution on things like stroke and on things like dementia. Also, air pollution affects people at different times in terms of their lifetime. We have particularly vulnerable communities are children and young people, or children and elderly people, where they may be either growing or they may have an underlying health condition, and air pollution can have a fairly substantial effect on different people at different stages of their lifetime. So the WHO have estimated that 91% of the world's population are living in locations where the air quality guideline levels are not being met, and this broadly breaks down to about 7 million premature deaths globally. The European Environment Agency have estimated it's 400,000 premature deaths in Europe, COMIAP, the Council for the Medical Effects of Air Pollution in the UK, estimated to be somewhere around 36 to 40,000 deaths. And air quality consultants in Bristol have estimated 300,000 premature deaths for Bristol area. Now, the difficulty with this sort of data is that they're not real deaths, they're statistical deaths, which makes communicating the health effects of air pollution quite challenging. There is a case going on at the moment in London where a young girl called Ella, who had an underlying respiratory problem, quite bad asthma, died during a pollution episode, and they have been able to link the pollution episodes with the health effects and sadly her passing away. So again, those connections are becoming much stronger. Our understanding of the health effects are growing over time, and because of that we're starting to see a growing consciousness in terms of the importance of air pollution. Now, how do we manage it in the UK? Well, we've got a two-tiered process. At a national level up, we've got a European directives called the Ambient Air Quality Directive and the National Emission Ceilings Directive. And these are directives that all the member states across Europe have to adhere to. At a local level, we had an Environment Act in 1995, which came in and required every local authority in the UK to review and assess air quality. And this involved putting monitoring in place, reviewing sources, doing very technical exercises with modelling, etc. Now, if they found a problem, they had to declare what's called an air quality management area, and then they had to develop an action plan. And that process has evolved gradually over time to be much more streamlined and efficient for local authorities. So local authorities have been monitoring and evaluating air quality in their regions for over 20 years now. And what we found is that almost 70% of local authorities around the country have one or more of these air quality management areas. What this means is that they've had an exceedance, or they've measured an exceedance of an air quality objective. So for nitrogen dioxide, this might be something like the annual mean, which is 40 micrograms. So anything over 40 micrograms, where relevant exposure exists, they would have to declare these spatially designated zones. And there's different approaches for different local authorities. For example, Birmingham on the left decided to declare the whole borough. Some local authorities have decided to just go down the main routes coming in and out of town. Some local authorities just declare a junction. It is entirely up to them how they might go about it. Now, all this evidence has started to come together, and a lot of the modelling at a national level at the UK government has started to come together to give us a new geography and a new understanding of pollution around the UK. So this data comes from the National Atmospheric Emissions Inventory that the UK government puts together. And you can see nitrogen dioxide on the left, PM10 in the middle, and carbon dioxide emissions on the right. And what's really obvious is the effect that our urban areas have on these pollutants, where we're seeing these red dots, and indeed the effect of the road network in terms of these pollution levels. So that really gives you a sense of the kind of spatial scales of these issues, where we're finding the most problems, and also where we need to focus our interventions. So what's happening in Bristol? Well, within Bristol, they have an air quality management area. It's been in place for almost 20 years. And this is this shaded area here, which is predominantly the city centre and some of the main routes in and out of the centre. Now, Bristol also has 6 continuous analysers up and running. These are quite expensive pieces of equipment, which give us hourly data on air pollution. And this is supplemented by a number of diffusion tubes looking at nitrogen dioxide around the city. Now, these diffusion tubes are a cheaper passive diffusion tube, which gives you a monthly average concentration within your area. And as you can see, the red dots is where we are above 40 micrograms and not compliant within Bristol. So still quite a bit of work to be done here. So what I've kind of explained to you is this idea of the where and the what. What are the technology, or what are the industries and the sources that generate pollution, and also focuses on the kind of the geographical locations and hotspots where we might have air quality problems. Now, a project that I've been involved in called Clare City has been looking at moving the conversation from the where and the what to the who and the why. And what we want to do is have a very different conversation with people and help them understand that it's not technology that generates pollution, but it's actually people. So what we've been trying to do is break down our air pollution and our carbon emissions data by different demographics, whether it's gender or whether it's age or whether it's income, and by different motives. So why you get behind the wheel of the car: traveling to work, taking kids to school, leisure time. And we've been doing this across 6 cities and regions around Europe, Bristol being our case study in the UK. And this is a sort of evidence that we're starting to explore. On the left hand side is a graph showing NOx emissions for Bristol. Quite a very user-friendly graph, but it's very technocentric. So it breaks it down by cars, buses, HGVs. It breaks it down by fuel types in terms of diesel cars or petrol cars. But that doesn't give people a sense of how their own day-to-day practices generate pollution. So what we've done is we've taken some of the Bristol data and we have fused a transport origin destination data set with travel survey data to try and understand the different motives behind air pollution. And this is data that has been produced by our project partners TML in Belgium. And what we can see is in Bristol, actually leisure time is one of the main motives as to why we get behind the wheel of the car. Whereas if we think about the conversation we're currently having, it seems to be commuting is the main focus, that morning and afternoon peak in terms of people commuting to and from work. But actually leisure time and shopping combined almost account for 50% of the kilometres travelled. So we really start to have a very different conversation with people in terms of why they get behind the wheel of the car. And we start to get a sense of, I feel like a sense of frustration in that they want to change, but they just feel entrenched in a certain pattern of behaviour. And we start to see these barriers that emerge in terms of not enough public transport, lack of frequency, lack of diversity, too expensive, too far away, I don't feel safe, taking the kids. These are all the barriers that are perceived by people, which means that they are entrenched in a certain behaviour where they unfortunately use their car. But as we were chatting to people and having these conversations, we started to realise there is a real appetite, not only in Bristol, but in all our case study cities. There is a real appetite for change. There's a real appetite for moving from high polluting choices to more lower polluting choices like active travel or like taking public transport. But to achieve those low polluting choices, we need to explore what are the enabling mechanisms to remove the barriers that are currently in place, and then thinking about what policy interventions an employer might put in place, a city council might put in place, national government might put in place to create that enabling environment so that greener choices become the social norm for everybody. Now, as we've been exploring this data, we've also been looking into the relationships between air pollution and socioeconomic status. Now, the data on the on the right-hand side here is from some colleagues who looked at MOT data from across England and Wales. And basically at the bottom, you've got households in poverty. And then up the left-hand side of the graph, you either have emissions, so these are pollution being generated, or you have concentrations, so this might be exposure to pollution. And what we have found very basically is that the richer you are, the more likely you are to generate pollution, but the least likely you are to be exposed to it. And conversely, the poorer you are, the most likely you are to be exposed to it, but the least likely you are to generate pollution. And this raises a real social equity debate and discussion around air pollution. Now, we did something similar in Wales, but we added a dimension. We took air pollution, we took socioeconomic status, and we put health data together to look at what was happening around Wales. And what we found was this trilemma, where you have a triumvirate of factors coming together to cause a major public health concern. And the main output of that is that if we want to address public health, and if we want to address air pollution, you can actually achieve a lot more by targeting these locations where this triumvirate of factors come together than perhaps taking a much broader approach. So there's a balance there between a national approach to addressing air quality to a much more localized consideration, particularly taking public health into account. So we took some of that analysis and we brought it down again to the Bristol level. And we started to look at the relationships, for example, between income and between the different motives of travel. And on the left-hand side here, what you see is people in Bristol who are perhaps wealthier are more likely to use the car, whereas those from a poorer background are more likely to use public transport. And again, we're seeing more uses for leisure, which is the yellow boxes, and more uses for commuting, which is the orange boxes, for those that are using the car. We also took that data and created these bivariate maps. So one map shows indices of multiple deprivation and nitrogen dioxide, and the other map shows indices of multiple deprivation and PM10 data. And while there isn't the same sort of strong linear relationship that we saw at a national level, what we do see is these certain hotspots, these red locations, particularly in the city centre, where you have deprivation and where you have high levels of air pollution. So again, it's an important factor to take into consideration when addressing air quality management. So what's the solution? There is no silver bullet. There is no one solution. Cities all over the UK, all over the southwest, all over Europe are looking at a number of different interventions, from car clubs to more active travel to clean air zones to green infrastructure. There's no one solution, but what we have learned is that you need to bring people on a journey with you. You need to help people to understand their role in the problem and also understand what they can do to try and address it. And we've actually seen that more recently in the effect that COVID-19 and the lockdown has had on transport and on air pollution. Because what's happened is that a factor has come into play, COVID-19 and the lockdown, which has had a massive reduction in the volume of transport on the road. It has actually removed people's need to commute to the shops, leisure time, etc. Now, it's not the reason we want to have these changes, but it's actually created almost a living lab experiment in terms of what would the effect be. Now, on the left, we've got data here from Ricardo, a UK consultancy, who have looked at monitoring sites all over the UK. And with the exception of one background site, we have seen a notable reduction in air pollution levels, particularly nitrogen dioxide levels, less so in terms of PM10 and ozone, but for nitrogen dioxide, we have certainly seen a reduction during the lockdown period. And the data on the right, this is a project that I'm also involved in called WeCount, which is a citizen science initiative where we are asking people to put these sensors, and a Raspberry Pi on their window to count cars, or small vehicles, large vehicles, cyclists, walkers, speed as well, as they go past on your road. And this initiative is running in Leuven in Belgium, Madrid, Dublin, Ljubljana in Slovenia, and will be starting in Cardiff soon. And what we have seen from this data, if we're moving from left to right, is that you see the initial data set, then the two red lines show you when lockdown came in. And then we've got motorised vehicles, which is blue, and active travel, which is green. And what we saw was active travel more or less dead steady, and in fact during lockdown increased fairly substantially. This is data from Leuven, increased fairly substantially. And motorised transport dropped quite substantially, but as lockdown started to ease, you can slowly see how the motorised transport data has started to move back up again, and how active travel and motorised transport have started to come together. The data ends around early June. So you get a sense that if you actually create an enabling environment, if you change the factor which influenced this change, this shift in behaviour, and actually created an enabling environment, you would see a reduction in air pollution. You would see a reduction in motorised vehicle. You would see an increase in active travel, which may be due to a perception of better road safety because there's less cars on the road. It may be due to more pop-up cycling infrastructure. There's a number of reasons behind that. But an enabling environment, the COVID lockdown has actually shown us that creating an enabling environment where people can make a greener choices to the way that they commute can actually have quite a positive impact on both transport and air quality. So one of the things we've learned out of Clare City is to take a very different conversation in terms of talking to people. My colleague on the left here, Dr. Joe Barnes, we created a 4 metre by 6 metre map of Bristol, in which kids and families could come along and find where they live and find where their school is, and have a conversation in terms of how they commute and whether they're in or outside an air quality management area. The sculpture on the bottom is basically a particle which is 3 million times bigger than a normal particle, created and is currently hanging in We the Curious in Bristol. And again, it's just about starting a conversation. But we also explore the idea that to engage a younger generation, we maybe need to move into gamification. So we made this Skylines game on the right hand side, and also started to exploring things like augmented reality. So as part of the Clare City project, we've made a number of different school kits available for primary schools and secondary schools, to explore everything from running citizens' assemblies to top trumps, to basically writing letters to elected officials and having a conversation around air pollution within our schools. So finally, the future is going to be difficult. We have got a growing population. We have got a growing population in particular in our urban areas, which may be for which may be a recipe for more pollution. But what we found is that if you have targeted interventions that identify these enabling policies so that greener choices become the social norm for everybody, and we've seen that during lockdown, then you can actually quite substantially impact not only transport but also air quality. What we've also seen is that technical innovation and societal innovation have to come together for this to happen. Technology alone is not going to solve this issue. The solutions we need to be putting in place need to be relevant and need to be actually connected to people's lived experiences. There is no point in putting interventions in place if people aren't going to use them because they don't work with their habits and their day-to-day practices and their day-to-day behaviours. If you want to have a conversation, that conversation must happen with a number of different engagement pathways, and we need to recognise that the public aren't some sort of Borg entity that all act, behave, move, think the same. Young people will think very differently from old people. Single people will act and behave very differently from single parents or a family of 4, for example. So we need to understand how people behave, why they do what they do, what are the day-to-day practices, and what are the perceived barriers to them acting and behaving in a different way. And finally, the challenges around air quality and indeed environmental management and climate change much broader can often be seen in a very, very negative light, in that it's too big, it's too difficult to deal with. While shifting the conversation to make it more relevant to people's lives can actually allow you to be a lot more positive in terms of how you frame the problem and in terms of how you might think about the solutions. And for example, here we've shown the Sustainable Development Goals and how air pollution actually touches on each and every single goal, either through resources, economy, ecosystems, social objectives and well-being, or indeed governance and education. Air pollution is central to the 17 goals. So that's air pollution. That's my particular interest in it, around kind of social practice and the role of people. And I think once you change the way you have this conversation, focusing not only on the technology, but also on people themselves and their motives for their behavior, then you can start to give people a better sense of ownership of the problem. You can start to give people then hopefully a better sense of solutions that they might have a role in implementing for cleaner, healthier futures for everyone. Thank you very much.